Do you have special ways that you remember things? Do you have certain methods or routines that you go through in order to not forget things which are important to you? When I was looking up on the internet about different methods which people use to remember things, in the past, before everybody began to rely on their phones and their computers to lay out their schedule for them, it was quite a common method was to have a piece of string and to tie it around your finger or a ribbon, and to tie these around your finger so that when you look at this piece of string or ribbon, it might act as a reminder of the thing that you knew that you were supposed to remember. I remember when I was younger and at school, what we would do instead of a ribbon is we would write different things on our arms and on our hands so that we wouldn't try to forget them. Maybe that was a slightly better way of doing it than a ribbon, because I'm sure many people would have tied a ribbon around their finger and then forgot what it was that they were supposed to be remembering in the first place. Well, as we've just come off of the Resurrection Sunday, as we've just come away from having a time to remember the events during Easter week that led to Jesus' resurrection, then it's quite a good time to reflect on why it is that we actually take the time to remember things. As we come to our reflections in the Psalms this week, as we look at Psalm 76 to 79, it is interesting because the Psalms reflect particularly on the importance of remembering, the importance of God's people, of remembering their history with God. As we look at Psalm 76, it talks about the importance of actively moving towards God. It says in verse 11 of 76, "Make your vows to the Lord your God and perform them. Let all around him bring gifts to him who is to be feared." The psalmist realized that there is no point trying to do things against God's will. Instead, it is so important that we align ourselves with God's will. And we do that by actively moving towards him. And as we do that, as I hope many of you have found during the Easter week, as you reflect on the events that led to Jesus' resurrection, it helps us to shift our focus from our own agenda, from the things which ultimately are not that important to us, and instead it helps to shift our focus onto God. If you take the time to have a read through these Psalms, which is well worth it, then you'll notice that Psalm 77 to 79 are really a classic example of the importance of remembering. Particularly, they focus on the great narratives that God's people remembered of when they were freed from slavery, of when they had been rescued by God, of when their salvation has been made possible. It says in Psalm 77 verse 11, "I will remember the deeds of the Lord. Yes, I will remember your wonders of old." And they remember these deeds because not only do they give them times of strength during times of trouble, not only do the deeds that God has done that they remember help them to realize that even when there's times when we may feel that God is absent, that we know that God is working things out according to his plan, according to his purposes. They also remember what God has done, because it's through remembering God that we are able to recognize his character, to begin to get to know him, to learn what we have to do to actively move towards him. It says in 78 verses 70, it says that God chose David his servant and took him from the sheepfolds. From following the nursing ewes, he brought them to shepherd Jacob his people, Israel his inheritance. With an upright heart, he shepherded them and guided them with his skillful hand. As we know from our Choose Your King series, David was a man after God's heart. And it was only by aligning himself with God, only by being fluent in the history of his people with God, that God was able to shepherd, that David was able to shepherd his people in a way that God had intended. It really does just bring back to us the significance of why it is that every year we spend a time in celebration and a time in remembering of Jesus's resurrection. Because in that we are reminded of Jesus's love, of his grace, of his mercy. And we'll find that as we follow the narratives through the Bible, from the very beginning of time when God created, to Jesus's sacrifice on the cross and his resurrection, to today, then we will notice that God's character is steadfast, that it doesn't change. Even though for us we will go through ups and downs in life, then we can always trust in the fact that God is unchanging, that his character is pure, that if we put our trust in him, if we actively work towards him, then we will be able to find the strength to get through any time or any obstacles that we might face. It is through remembering that we are able to proclaim what Jesus has done in our lives to the next generation. And isn't that exactly what the Psalms are for us? Is they are a great witness of God's active work and rescue and salvation in people's lives across history. And as we witness to the coming generations, then we're able to be a part of this grand narrative. We are able to be a part of God's story within history. It says in Psalm 79, verse 13, that we, God's people, the sheep of his pasture, will give thanks to him forever. From generation to generation, we will recount your praise. It is only by looking backwards that we are able to look forward. It is only by looking backwards at God's faithfulness that we are able to look forward to the promises which are in store for us. The great inheritance that was made available, possible on Easter Sunday, that we remembered just this last weekend. So, if you haven't yet come up with a method of how you might begin to remember how God has worked in your life, then maybe I would suggest that you use a bit of this time to think about how you might be able to better recall all the ways that God has worked with your life. And maybe as you think on this, maybe you might realise some opportunities in the coming weeks where you're able to proclaim what God has done in your life. It is only through practice that we will be able to become more natural at sharing the good news that we have found in Christ. I hope that the Psalms and the rich resource that they are might just act as a source of encouragement for you, as you begin to recognize how your story is a part of the greater story of mankind, and the reality of the salvation of all of those people who put their trust in Jesus Christ. So now maybe you'd like to take a time to have some time in prayer, to reflect on all the different ways that God has worked within your life. Maybe you'd like to take this time to recall memories, special memories which you share specifically with God. Maybe you'd also like to take this time to commit yourself to be spending more time with God, to be able to develop new memories with Him as we continue in our story.